bored on purpose. There is a specific competitive edge available to anyone willing to sit through the part everyone else abandons, the repetitive middle stretch of any serious undertaking, long after its novelty has worn off and long before its results have arrived. Most people flee this stretch the moment it stops feeling stimulating, reaching for a new project, a new distraction, a new source of the dopamine the original task has stopped reliably supplying. The work that actually compounds into mastery happens almost entirely inside the stretch they just fled. The masses treat boredom as a signal to change course, evidence that the current task has stopped being worth their attention. The people who quietly outworked entire fields across history understood something considerably less comfortable. Boredom is not a signal that the work has gone wrong. It is simply the ordinary emotional weather of any task serious enough to require real repetition. And tolerating that weather, rather than fleeing it, is one of the most reliably underused advantages available to anyone willing to build it. This is not a study in grinding without purpose. It is a study in a specific, trainable capacity, comfort with monotony, that turns unglamorous repetition into a moat almost no distraction-hungry competitor is willing to build alongside you. 10 laws follow. Everything ahead depends on a single reversal. Boredom is not evidence that a task has gone wrong. It is simply the ordinary weather of any work serious enough to require real repetition. Begin with the law. Every other law in this record depends on. The first law: let repetition be your training ground. Henrietta Leavitt spent years at the Harvard College Observatory, cataloging the brightness of thousands of variable stars on photographic plates, work that consisted almost entirely of repetitive, painstaking measurement, with no immediate reward beyond the next plate in the stack, work her own era considered unglamorous enough to be delegated largely to women paid modest wages for what was viewed as clerical labor. The pattern she eventually identified within that repetitive cataloging became the foundation for measuring distances across the universe, a discovery that emerged directly from her tolerance for the monotonous middle of the work, rather than from any single dramatic insight. Her method is the reason astronomers can even today reasonably determine how far away a distant galaxy actually is, and it remains one of the most important measuring tools in the whole of astronomy. Vera Rubin spent years collecting precise, repetitive measurements of galaxy rotation speeds, work that required painstaking, unglamorous data collection sustained across many observing sessions before a pattern became clear enough to interpret. The measurements themselves were not individually exciting. Their sheer accumulated volume, sustained without her attention wandering to something more immediately stimulating, eventually provided some of the strongest evidence for the existence of dark matter. This is the first law. Mastery is built almost entirely from repetition, and repetition is, almost by definition, the least stimulating part of any serious undertaking. The masses seek out the exciting first attempt and the celebrated final result, treating the repetitive middle as something to rush through as quickly as possible. The strategist treats that middle as the actual training ground, understanding that whatever compounds into skill or discovery does so precisely inside the stretch everyone else is trying to escape. There is a documented principle behind this worth naming directly. Skill acquisition research consistently shows that deliberate, repeated practice, not talent, and not a single moment of insight, accounts for the overwhelming majority of expert performance across nearly every studied domain. The masses want the insight without the repetition that makes it possible. The strategist has made peace with the fact that there is no shortcut around the repetition itself. Translate this into an ordinary skill or project: the 100th rehearsal of a presentation, the 10th revision of a draft, the repeated, unremarkable practice of a skill long after it stopped feeling like discovery. The masses look for a faster route past this stretch, assuming a shortcut must exist somewhere. The strategist has simply accepted that this stretch is not an obstacle blocking the path to mastery. It is the path. Repetition builds the skill. What determines whether that repetition ever happens at all is a separate, harder discipline, resisting the urge to abandon it the moment something newer looks more interesting. The second law: refuse the itch for constant novelty. Barbara McClintock spent decades studying the genetics of maize, returning to the same fields and the same specimens across growing season after growing season. Long after the work had stopped offering the kind of novelty that keeps most careers moving toward the next new subject, her sustained attention to a single, narrow area of study eventually revealed the existence of mobile genetic elements, a discovery that took years of unfashionable, repeated observation to notice, and decades more before the wider scientific community fully credited its significance. Significance eventually recognized with a Nobel Prize, awarded to her alone, for reshaping the basic understanding of how genes actually behave. Annie Jump Cannon personally classified the spectra of hundreds of thousands of stars over the course of her career, developing and refining a stellar classification system through sheer, sustained repetition of an extraordinarily tedious cataloging process that she continued, star by star, for decades, well past the point where the task's novelty could possibly have still been the source of her motivation. The classification system she built from that repetition is, with only minor updates, still the exact system astronomers use today to categorize every star in the sky. The masses experience the itch for something new as an urgent signal worth following, moving on to a fresh project the moment the current one stops feeling stimulating. The second law identifies this itch for what it actually is, a craving for the feeling of progress rather than progress itself, and a strategist who has learned to recognize the difference stays with the unglamorous, familiar problem considerably longer than the itch alone would ever permit. Consider the ordinary version: the pull to start a new hobby, a new system, a new approach the moment the current one starts feeling routine, even when the current one has not yet actually stopped working. The strategist interrogates this pull before acting on it, asking whether the current approach has genuinely failed or whether it has simply stopped feeling novel. Two entirely different conditions the restless mind tends to confuse. Refusing novelty keeps you at the task. The third law addresses what the task itself actually feels like once its novelty has genuinely worn off. The third law: let boredom be where the real work happens. Wilhelmina Fleming reviewed tens of thousands of photographic plates of stellar spectra over her career at the Harvard Observatory, work that was, by any reasonable measure, extraordinarily monotonous. The same careful visual comparison, plate after plate, for years. It was precisely this sustained, repetitive review that allowed her to notice the faint, unusual spectral signature that led to the identification of what would later be recognized as a white dwarf star, a discovery hidden inside exactly the kind of tedious cataloging most observers would have long since stopped paying close attention to. That faint signature was one of the earliest identifications of what astronomers now call a white dwarf, a category considered essential to understanding how stars age and die. The masses flee boredom the moment it arrives, treating it as evidence that attention has been misapplied. The third law insists that boredom is frequently the precise emotional signature of the work that actually matters, repetitive, unglamorous, offering no immediate reward, and that fleeing it simply means abandoning the task at the exact point it was beginning to compound into something significant. There is a documented pattern in creative and intellectual work worth naming directly. The period immediately preceding a breakthrough is frequently reported, in hindsight, as the most tedious and unrewarding stretch of the entire process, a stretch many practitioners describe having nearly abandoned shortly before the insight that made the tedium worthwhile finally arrived. Boredom, in this light, is not evidence of failure. It is frequently the last obstacle standing directly before the result. Recognizing boredom as productive is one thing. Actually tolerating it, repeatedly, without reaching for a distraction, requires something closer to a trained immunity. The fourth law: build immunity to the craving for stimulation. Wangari Maathai's Greenbelt movement eventually resulted in tens of millions of trees planted across Kenya, an outcome built entirely from an extraordinarily repetitive, unglamorous unit of labor. One seedling, planted, watered, and tended, repeated across decades by an enormous and sustained volunteer effort that offered no single dramatic moment of stimulation to sustain it. The scale of the eventual outcome depended entirely on a sustained tolerance for the same small, repeated action performed without interruption over an enormous stretch of time. The movement's impact was significant enough that she became the first African woman awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for work that, at its core, never stopped being one repeated seedling at a time. The masses have trained, often without realizing it, a low tolerance for any activity that does not offer regular, frequent stimulation, reaching for a distraction the moment a task's engagement dips even slightly. The fourth law asks for a deliberately built immunity to that craving, not suppression of the discomfort, but a genuine tolerance developed the way any tolerance is developed, through repeated, deliberate exposure to exactly the kind of unstimulating repetition the craving is trying to escape. This mirrors a principle well established in the study of attention and dependency: constant exposure to high stimulation activity, rapid task switching, frequent novelty, continuous entertainment raises the baseline of stimulation the mind expects, making ordinary, unstimulating tasks feel considerably more unbearable by comparison. The strategist deliberately lowers this baseline through sustained practice with low stimulation work, specifically so that the unglamorous middle of any serious undertaking stops feeling unbearable at all. A trained tolerance for tedium is a private discipline. The fifth law turns that same tolerance into a competitive advantage other people can actually observe. The fifth law: let the unglamorous task be your moat. Mary Somerville spent years on the painstaking, unglamorous work of translating and expanding a major work of celestial mechanics into English, a task requiring sustained, repetitive precision across mathematics few of her contemporaries were willing to sit with at that level of detail. The resulting work became a standard scientific text precisely because so few competitors were willing to sustain the tedious labor her translation actually required. Her explanatory skill was considered so significant to making advanced science accessible that the word scientist itself was coined, in part, to describe the breadth of what she had accomplished. Jianxiong Wu conducted repeated, meticulous experimental verification of her physics research, running the same delicate procedures multiple times with exacting consistency rather than accepting a single promising result at face value, a repetitive rigor considerably more demanding than the field's ordinary standard required, and the resulting confidence in her findings became a large part of what made her experimental work so difficult to challenge. Her experiment disproved a principle of physics that had been assumed unbreakable for decades, providing proof so solid that two of her male colleagues received the Nobel Prize for the theory her repeated verification alone had actually confirmed. The masses avoid the unglamorous task specifically because it offers no visible reward for the tedium it requires, leaving that exact task available and uncontested for whoever is actually willing to do it. The fifth law identifies this as the clearest possible moat. A task boring enough that most competitors decline to do it thoroughly becomes, for the person who does, an advantage nobody else was willing to build. The ordinary version of this shows up constantly in professional life: the tedious documentation nobody wants to write, the careful follow-up nobody wants to do, the unglamorous maintenance work everyone assumes someone else will handle. The strategist treats each of these not as an imposition, but as unclaimed territory, because a competitive advantage nobody else is willing to build is, by definition, available to whoever simply does the boring work required to claim it. An unglamorous task, done well, is a single advantage. The sixth law scales the same principle across an entire project's duration, not just one isolated task within it. The sixth law: master the long, plain stretch, not just the exciting sprint. Isabella Bird undertook extended, difficult travels across remote regions that required long, monotonous stretches of difficult terrain between the more remarkable moments her later writing would go on to describe, sustaining herself through days of unremarkable, exhausting travel that offered nothing resembling the excitement of arrival, in order to eventually reach the destinations her work became known for documenting. Her travel writing made her one of the most widely read authors of her era on the regions she covered, and she later became the first woman elected to the Royal Geographical Society, an honor built on exactly the monotonous travel most of her readers never saw. The masses train and prepare energetically for the exciting parts of any undertaking, the launch, the opening, the dramatic middle crisis, and underprepare considerably for the long, plain stretch that makes up most of any serious project's actual duration. The sixth law insists that the plain stretch, not the exciting sprint at either end of it, is where most undertakings are actually won or lost, and a woman who has specifically trained herself to sustain that plain middle outlasts competitors who trained only for the parts that felt worth training for. This requires a specific kind of preparation the masses rarely undertake, rehearsing not just the exciting opening or the dramatic climax of an undertaking, but the plain, unremarkable middle stretch that will make up the overwhelming majority of the actual time spent on it. The strategist trains for the boredom itself, the same way an athlete trains for the specific demands of an event, rather than assuming willpower alone will carry her through a stretch she never actually prepared to sustain. Mastering the plain stretch of a single project is one scale of this discipline. Choosing to stay with a single subject or a single skill across years rather than sampling broadly is a considerably larger version of the same choice. The seventh law: choose depth over the next shiny thing. Margaret Mead sustained extended periods of detailed, repetitive fieldwork observation within single communities, resisting the pull toward a wider survey of many different cultures in favor of the slower, less immediately stimulating work of genuinely understanding one community in depth before drawing broader conclusions, a discipline that gave her research a level of grounding. A faster, more scattered approach would not have provided. That depth of fieldwork made her one of the most widely read and influential anthropologists of the 20th century, shaping how the entire discipline of cultural anthropology came to be practiced. The masses are perpetually drawn toward the next shiny opportunity, the new project that promises the stimulation the current one has stopped supplying, and mistake this restlessness for ambition. The seventh law suggests the opposite is frequently true. The ambition that actually produces something significant is the one willing to stay with a single subject long after its novelty has worn off, extracting a depth of understanding a more restless, novelty-seeking approach could never reach. The modern equivalent of this discipline is choosing to go deeper into a single skill, relationship, or body of knowledge, rather than sampling broadly across many, even when sampling broadly offers more frequent, immediate novelty. The strategist recognizes that depth and breadth draw from the same limited attention, and that the frequent small rewards of sampling widely come at the direct cost of the considerably larger reward available only to whoever stays long enough to go deep. Choosing depth determines where your attention goes. The eighth law determines how sustainable that choice actually is once the repetition it requires starts to feel like an obligation. The eighth law: let repetition become ritual, not restriction. Gertrude Bell conducted extensive, repetitive archaeological and diplomatic documentation across decades of work in the Middle East, cataloging sites and details with a consistency that transformed what could easily have felt like tedious record-keeping into a discipline she approached with genuine devotion rather than obligation, treating the repeated work itself as meaningful rather than as a chore to be endured on the way to some other, more exciting outcome. That sustained documentation made her one of the most influential Western figures in the region's history, consulted directly on the political arrangements that shaped the borders of the modern Middle East. The masses experience a repeated task as a restriction imposed on their time, something to be minimized or rushed through. The eighth law suggests reframing the same repetition as ritual, an act performed not merely to reach an outcome, but valued in its own right. A shift that changes nothing about the actual repetition required, but changes everything about how sustainable that repetition turns out to be across the years it actually takes. This distinction matters because the same repeated action, framed as obligation versus framed as ritual, produces measurably different levels of sustained engagement over time. The same task endured resentfully burns out considerably faster than the identical task performed as a chosen, valued practice. The strategist does not change the work. She changes her relationship to repeating it. Ritual sustains a repetition emotionally. The ninth law protects something more practical: the actual quality of the work, which restlessness quietly degrades even when the repetition itself continues. The ninth law: let a calm, unbothered mind be your competitive edge. Elizabeth Smith Friedman conducted extraordinarily tedious cross-referencing and pattern analysis across thousands of intercepted messages in her code-breaking work, sustaining a calm, patient attention across work that offered no stimulation whatsoever in the moment, understanding that the eventual breakthrough depended entirely on maintaining that calm through the tedious cross-referencing rather than rushing it out of restlessness. That patient cross-referencing dismantled major Prohibition-era smuggling networks and later broke Nazi spy communications during the Second World War, work whose significance was kept classified for decades after she'd done it. The masses bring an anxious, restless energy to any task that has stopped offering immediate reward, and that restlessness itself frequently degrades the quality of the tedious work still in front of them. The ninth law suggests that a calm, unbothered relationship with tedium is not simply more pleasant to sustain. It is measurably more effective because restlessness introduces errors and shortcuts that patient, calm repetition does not. The ordinary version of this law shows up whenever tedious, careful work is rushed out of impatience, the double check skipped, the detail glossed over, simply because sitting with the tedium any longer had become unbearable. The strategist treats her own restlessness as a signal to slow down rather than speed up, understanding that the errors restlessness produces typically cost far more time to correct than the patience would have cost to sustain in the first place. 9 laws describe the specific mechanics of tolerating repetition well. The final law names what all of them, sustained together, actually look like from the outside. The 10th law: let the ones who outwork everyone be simply the ones who never needed entertaining. Katherine Johnson performed extensive, repeated manual calculations for early American spaceflights, work requiring the same careful arithmetic, checked and rechecked, across enormous volumes of unglamorous computation, sustained with a consistency that made her calculations trusted, even above the newly introduced computers, meant to replace exactly that kind of repetitive work. Her trajectory calculations were the ones astronaut John Glenn personally requested be checked by hand before he trusted the mission that made him the first American to orbit the Earth. This is the final law, and the truth every other law in this record has been building toward. The woman who appears to simply outwork everyone around her is rarely working with more raw talent or more available time. She has simply built, deliberately, a tolerance for the unstimulating, repetitive middle of any serious undertaking that most of her competitors never trained themselves to sit through at all. Every law in this record, examined together, reduces to a single discipline: the capacity to remain engaged with unstimulating, repetitive work for considerably longer than an untrained mind finds comfortable. This capacity is not a talent some people are simply born with. It is a tolerance built the same way any tolerance is built, through repeated, deliberate practice at doing the boring thing anyway. 10 laws, 1 underlying discipline, a trained tolerance for the unstimulating middle that everyone else abandons first. Closing on the patience that never needed an audience. None of the women in this record found the repetition thrilling. What they built instead was a tolerance for its absence of thrill, a willingness to keep going precisely when the task had stopped offering any reason to, other than the fact that the task itself still mattered. The masses will always chase the next stimulating thing, mistaking restlessness for ambition. You now have 10 laws describing the quieter, considerably rarer discipline that actually outworks it. Patience with the boring middle, sustained for as long as the middle requires, by a woman who never needed the work to entertain her in order to keep doing it.